All right, so today's lesson, this is a biggie, big lesson, okay? So this is our standard, actually, boys and girls. So this is where actually fifth grade math begins. Believe it or not, everything we were doing was leading up to this lesson. So this is our biggie. Our math goal is to add fractions with an uncommon denominator. So that's our new thing for fifth grade. Everything we've been doing is leading up to this. So do you know anything about how to add fractions with an uncommon denominator? Chances are you probably don't, because this is a fifth grade standard, okay? If you don't know anything, that's okay. Write down, I don't know anything. I'm gonna rock my mind, okay? All right, so let's start. So our first problem says I have 1/2 plus 1/3. Here are my halves, here are my thirds. How am I going to add that? Now I can't take this 1/2 and add it to a third because they are not a common denominator. Remember, in order to add fractions, up to now, our denominators were the same. So now I got to figure out, how can I change this into the same common denominator? Okay, so a couple of things I can do. Remember what we did before to make equivalent fractions? Okay, so it's kind of like what we did then. Okay, so I'm going to look at the 2 and the 3 and I'm going to say, what do they have in common? What could I do? How about 6? Is 6 a number they both have in common? Can 6 be divided by 2 and by 3? Yeah, right? So one way to do this is to think about splitting up our fraction bars and to make sixes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that in just a second. All right, so what I did, I took my halves and I made it into 6 equal pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I took my thirds and I made those into 6 equal pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now that tells me that I have 1/2, so it's this much, plus my 1/3, which is this much. So now I can see that that turns into my 1/2 is equal to 1, 2, 3, 3 out of 6. So my 1/2 becomes 3 out of 6 plus my 1/3 becomes 1, 2 out of 6. And now does this look familiar? Right? So now I can just simply add 5, 6. So what I did is I had to figure out how to split these with a number that they shared in common, and they both share a 6. Okay, that's basically what I did. All right, for our next question, Aaron mixed 1/3 cup of orange juice and 1/4 cup of pineapple juice. How much juice does Aaron have? So Ann tells me that I'm going to add them together, right? So I'm going to add a third and a fourth. So that one looks like this. So here are my thirds and here are my fourths, okay? So my thirds and my fourths, I have to split them into the same parts. And I'm splitting them into 12, and that's going to become my common denominator because 3 and 4, I'm thinking, what numbers do they have in common? What numbers can I both divide into using a 3 and a 4? And the answer is 12. So I'm splitting them up into 12s. And so here's my thirds, and here is my fourths. Okay, so if I were to do this, now it's going to become my thirds becomes 1, 2, 3, 4 12s. So it becomes 4 12s plus my fourths becomes 1, 2, 3 12s. 3 12s. And now I know how to do that, right? This should be, I know how to do that, 7 12s. So this is just the logic behind it. We are splitting them into the same amount of equal pieces so then I can add them up. I need to find a common denominator, okay? And there's different ways to do that. So that's the visual part of it. All right, so on this one, write this down. So one way to find a common denominator, okay? This is one way to do it. So after I explain it, pause the video and write this down. One way to do it is ask yourself, does the lowest denominator go into the biggest denominator? If yes, use the bigger denominator. So I'm looking at the denominators here. My denominators are 6 and 3. So does the lowest go into the biggest? Does 3 go into 6? Yes, 3 goes into 6. So what's going to be my denominator? 6. All right, so watch. So this is why I like doing them vertically, because it's easier. So I just rewrote the equal sign 6, 6, my denominator, okay? So 6 times what is 6? 6 times 1. So I'm going to multiply this by 1, and I get 6. So whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. So if I multiply this by 1, I got to multiply the top by 1. So I multiply this by 1. And you should be doing this with me. So if you haven't started doing this with me, stop the video, catch up to me, and then come back to me. 1 times 1 is 1. Okay, so now I got to do the same thing for this one. 6 is my common denominator. How many times does 3 go into 6? Good, 2 times. So if I'm going to multiply that by 2. So if I multiply that by 2, if I multiply the denominator by 2, I got to multiply the numerator by 2. Whatever I do to the top, I do to the bottom. Multiply that by 2. 2 times 2 is 4. It gives me 4, 6. Now I know how to do this, right? 4 plus 1 is 5, 5, 6. So that's one way to do these. The only drawback with this, that the lowest denominator doesn't always go into the biggest denominator. Okay, always check that first because you want to find the lowest common denominator. Okay, so always check. Does 3 go into 6? No. So find the lowest. Does it go into the other one? If not, we're going to have to find another way. Okay, so let's look at another way to do these. Okay, well, we'll look at another way in just a second. Let's try one. So you try this one doing the exact same steps that I just did, then come back to me. All right, hopefully you got 9/10. If you didn't, remember, ask yourself, does 5 go into 10? Yes, so that's going to be my denominator for both. So I went ahead and did that. I wrote that. And then I said 5 times what is 10? Well, 5 times 2 is 10. So if I multiply the bottom by 2, I got to multiply the top by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. And then 1 times 2 is 2. 10 times 1 is 10. I said what times what? So if I multiply by 1, I got to multiply the top by 1. 7 times 1 is 7. 7 plus 2 is 9/10. Okay, now we're going to look at a different way of doing these. Okay, write this one down also. So let me explain it and then you can write it down. So another way to do these is to find a common denominator. To find a common denominator is to skip count using the multiples of the denominator. So let me explain that. So for example, my first thing, when I said try to see, does one go into one denominator go into the other one? 3, does 3 go into 4? No, so that's not going to work. So what you can do is this step using the multiples of the denominator. So I'm going to skip count by 3. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. I'd like to do the first 4 or 5. And I'm going to skip count by 4, 4, 8, 12, 16. And I do it one on top of the other, just the way they are. So the 3s were here, so I did those on top. And then the 4s were here, so I did those. Then I'm going to say, okay, do they have a number in common? Yes, right here, the 12. The 12 is what they have in common. So 12 is my least common denominator. And then I can just do the exact same thing. All right, so I did the same thing. I did my fraction bar and I put a 12 in both of my denominators because that's my common denominator for both of them. And then I said 4 times what is 12? 4 times 3. So if I multiply the bottom by 3, I got to multiply the top by 3. 1 times 3 is 3. And then I said 3 times what is 12? 3 times 4 is 12. So 3 times 4 is 12, so multiply the bottom by 4. I got to multiply the top by 4. 1 times 4 is 4. And then I just add like normal, 7, 12. So that's a second way. So go ahead and stop the video and write down this way, please. And remember to put the multiples of the first fraction on the top and then the multiples of the second fraction of your denominators at the bottom, and then ring them together. All right, so try this one by yourself. Now again, see, if you look, 4, does 4 go into 6? Nope. So you're gonna have to find the least common denominator. So try this one, rewrite it up and down. I like writing this way because I want you to see it, that it can be written vertically or it could be written horizontally. So write them, it could be, this one's written horizontally, write it vertically, and then see if you can do this one, finding the least common denominator using the multiples. Okay, if you got 11/12, you'd be correct. So what I did is I took my numerator 6 and I did the multiples of 6, 6, 12, 18, and then I stopped. And then I did my multiples of 4. Usually all you have to do is 3 or 4 of them, and you should find a least common multiple by doing that. And then I did my 4s, 4, 8, 12, 16. I said, oh, look, 12. They both have a 12 in common. So 12 is going to be my least common denominator. So I wrote that in my denominator. And then I said 4 times what is 12? 3. And if I wasn't sure, look, 1, 2, 3, it's a third number in. Times 3 times 3, 3 times 3 is 9. And 6 times what is 12? I wasn't sure, 1, 2, it's my second number in. So I multiply the top by 2, and then I get 2. 1 times 2 is 2, so I get 9 plus 2 is 11. I get 11/12. Oh, and by the way, if you didn't write down the other one, the second way, please make sure you do that, because that's the way that I want you to do it, finding the least common multiples. That's going to be the best way to do it. Try one first. Does one go into the other? Like this one, try it. Does 4 go into 5? No. So you could do the multiples, or here's the shortcut, and this will always, always, always work. The only reason why I don't like you using this one just per se is because when I ask you to simplify, this is not going to be your simplest answer. So that's why I like you to find the least common multiple. That's always going to give you your lowest common, your most simplified way of solving the problem. And it'll make more sense as we move on. Okay. But so for right now, just know this is another option. Okay. So how I do this. I multiply the denominators together, and this will always work. So I do, what are my denominators? 4 and 5. So what's 4 and 5? 4 times 5, 20. So that's my denominator. 20 is my denominator down here. And so I did the same thing. 5 times what is 20? It was my 4, because it was the opposite, right? So I multiplied the bottom by 4, the top by 4, that gives me 4. So then I use my opposite denominator, which was my other denominator was 5, so I multiply that by 5, multiply that by 5, that gives me 5. 1 times 5 is 5, and then I just simply add 5 plus 4 is 9/20. Oh, how did I get 12s here? There's a mistake there, right? That should be 20ths, 9/20. See, even teachers make mistakes. When I did my slideshow, I made a mistake there. So it should be 9/20 is my answer. All right. All right, so you try one. 3/11 and plus 1/2. So notice, first thing, try. Does the lowest denominator go into the biggest? Does 2 go into 11? No. So you could skip count, or you could do the one we just did. Now, obviously, I want you to do the one we just did, right? Because we're practicing it that way. Use one denominator and the other denominator to find your common denominator, and then solve, and then come back to me. All right, well, hopefully you got 17 out of 22. And if you didn't, so watch me if you didn't. So I use the opposite. So 11 times 2 is 22. That's my denominator. So if I multiply, I'm going to use the 11 from here and bring it down. So 2 times 11 is 22. And then if I do multiply this by 11, I got to multiply that by 11. 1 times 11 is 11. And then I do this one. 11 times 2 is 22. I use the opposite denominator, bring it up, bring the opposite denominator. Whatever I do to the bottom, I got to do the top. So 3 times 2 is 6. 11 plus 6 is 17 out of 22. Okay. All right. So what did you learn today? So today's lesson is a huge one. Okay. So learning how to add with uncommon denominators. That's our big standard in 5th grade, and we're going to be using that a lot, okay? So proof of learning, do a problem, and then any reflection or questions you still have. So this one's a biggie. So if you don't understand, go back and rewatch the video, the 3 different ways. So one way, right? Does one denominator go into the other? Always try that first. If that doesn't work, then do your multiples. And then if you've done like 4 or 5 multiples and you're still haven't found it, then just use the opposite denominator, each opposite denominator to find it, multiply them together, and then you'll find a common denominator. All right.